Right. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Just a couple of quick announcements. The usual things. If you've got a cell phone with you, please put it on mute. If you are joined on the Zoom and you're in the room, please put your mic on mute for some reason. Those at home, just remember to mute your mics unless you're speaking while you're on Zoom, please. And then just a quick note on next month's meeting, we're going to have Professor Roger Jean from WITS, who will be speaking in person here in Hermanus. He was part of the team that did that, the first image of the black hole. And he's going to give us some updates on that straight from the horse's mouth. It's going to be very, very interesting. But the date has been changed from the 16th of June to 24th of June, a Wednesday, to suit him when he will be here. So that will still change on the calendar. Our new secretary has still got to get into the calendar and to be able to change that. Okay, then I'm going to ask Peter Kotze to introduce Professor Mankies, please, and kick off. Thank you. Go ahead, please, Peter. Peter Kotze, are you there? Peter Kotze, your mic is muted again.
Mute. No, it's...
Okay, now we can hear you. Okay, you can go ahead and introduce...
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Piet Mankies in Hermanus via Zoom. He's a very well-known, internationally acclaimed researcher in the field of transient and variable objects in the universe. And tonight he's going to speak on a topic that's very close to his heart, and that is the Boyden Observatory, which has played a crucial and very important role in identifying the southern hemisphere sky, or the sky in the southern hemisphere, over the past century and a half. So, Pete, without further ado, please go ahead. Welcome, and thank you very much for everything.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this introduction, and thank you also very much for this invitation. It's always a great pleasure to share what has been discovered at the Boyden Observatory with friends and colleagues. So obviously, if we want to talk about the Boyden Observatory, which is about 25 kilometers outside Bloemfontein, obviously we must give a historical perspective. Now, our journey started at the Harvard College Observatory at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it was in the late 19th century when Edward Pickering, who was the director of the Harvard College Observatory at that stage, decided that they need to find a site in the southern hemisphere to get access to the Magellanic Clouds. And obviously we know that the richest part of the Milky Way, especially the center of the Milky Way galaxy, passes overhead in the night sky in the winter months at a declination of around -29, -30 degrees. So obviously that is obviously the southern hemisphere that contains very, very rich star fields combined with the Magellanic Clouds. So he was looking for a site to obviously start the Southern Observatory, and he gave that task to Solon Bailey to go and look for a site in the Southern Hemisphere. And that was when they identify a site in Peru, in Arequipa. So the Boyden Observatory was basically relocated to Arequipa in 1890 to 1891. So they started the Boyden Southern Station in Arequipa at an altitude of about 2.5 kilometers above sea level. And they also operated a meteorological station there on the summit there of El Misti, which is a very high mountain in the Andes at about an altitude of 5.8 kilometers. I can just mention Uriah Boyden. Uriah Boyden was a mechanical engineer, and he left obviously a trust of a few $100,000 to start this southern site, the Southern Boyden Station in the Southern Hemisphere. And it was they specifically asked for a high altitude site in the Southern Hemisphere. Obviously, that is when weather conditions doesn't play such a dramatic role. So that is where they looked for a site in the Southern Hemisphere in Arequipa, Peru. There, and that is where the observatory was obviously started in 1891, 1890. So quite a number of very famous discoveries were made. So, and the most prominent of the astronomical telescopes that were relocated.
This meeting is being recorded.
From Pasadena, from Mount Wilson, the summit of Mount Wilson, was this 13-inch refractor telescope, which was built by Alvin Clark and his sons. I can just mention that the lenses of this telescope were hand polished. It took Alvin Clark and his sons a couple of months to polish these lenses, and this telescope was instrumental in quite a number of very, very important astronomical discoveries, and it is still operational. This telescope is still operational just at the Boyden Observatory outside Bloemfontein. So one of the first very, very important discoveries made with this modest telescopes by modern standards, the 13-inch refractor, was by Annie Jump Cannon. Now, Annie Jump Cannon was revolutionizing stellar astronomy because she was taking the spectra of stars, and we know how spectra are taken about. That is obviously when obviously atoms are making transitions as a result of temperatures from lower to higher temperatures to higher energy levels, and then obviously the electrons in the higher energy levels can drop back to the lower energy levels and emit a line of emission at a very fixed frequency. Otherwise, emission can be absorbed at very fixed frequencies, then they are called absorption lines. So most stars basically display absorption spectra. And by studying these absorption spectra of stars, Annie Jump Cannon basically could categorize stars from cold to hot. And we all know in astronomy the very famous or sort of rhyme, and that is, "Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me." And that all originated with Annie Jump Cannon, the work that she did with the 13-inch refractor telescope, which is currently at Boyden, but was then at in Arequipa. This person doesn't need any introduction, Cecilia Payne-Kapuskin. Now, this telescope that was at the Arequipa station at Boyden took an enormous amount of photos of the stars, and she was obviously equipping this telescope with an objective prism. That's a prism that was obviously that could be positioned at the objective lens of the telescope, and obviously break up the light in its colors, and obviously project it on glass plates, and she could obviously capture the spectra of stars. And by carefully analyzing the spectra of these stars, she found out that most stars are made almost entirely of hydrogen and helium, and obviously fundamentally revolutionizing modern astrophysics. I can just mention that she did this with her PhD thesis, and I think it is, I don't exaggerate if I say that it is probably the best PhD thesis ever published in terms of the output and the results that she obtained with her studies. Then also, Henrietta Leavitt, she does not need any introduction. She was studying Cepheid variables, and in her studies, she basically found out that the pulsation period of a Cepheid variable is directly linked to the absolute magnitude of that Cepheid variable. So that is an extremely important result. If the pulsation period of this variable star is directly linked to the absolute magnitude, then obviously one can compare the absolute magnitude with the apparent magnitude, and that difference between the absolute magnitude and the apparent magnitude give you a very good indication of what the distance is of the Cepheid variable to the observer at Earth. So this was a very, very powerful tool to use Cepheid variables in distant galaxies like the Andromeda galaxy, which is 2 million light years away from us. And by studying the pulsation period of these variables, obviously one can determine the distance of these sources or these stars from us here on Earth. And Edwin Hubble used this tool, and he was the first person who basically determined that the Andromeda galaxy was outside the Milky Way galaxy. And this obviously opened up the cosmic distance ladder to external galaxies and obviously to the cosmos at large. So that was absolutely fundamental. But as a result of various reasons, climate as well as also corruption in Peru, they decided to move the observatory to a different location, but also in the southern hemisphere. And then obviously Solon Bailey was sent out again on an expedition to find another suitable site in the southern hemisphere that was not in Peru. And he identified a couple of sites here in South Africa, in the Karoo, among other close to Colesberg, Edinburgh. And the other one was here 27 kilometers northeast of Bloemfontein, the Boyden site, which was favorable then because it was about 27 kilometers from a big railway station. And they could obviously ship in the telescopes and all the equipment into South Africa and transport it up by train. And then the last couple of miles or kilometers, they used these old lorries or trucks to move it from Bloemfontein station to Boyden Kopje, about, like I've said, 25 kilometers outside Bloemfontein. So that was done in 1927. So next year it will be 100 years that this observatory would be here, located here at Boyden Kopje outside Bloemfontein. And the first director was Dr. John Paraskevopoulos. He was the first director of the Harvard College Observatory Boyden Southern Station that was obviously positioned here at the Boyden Observatory outside Bloemfontein. The cost of that relocation was about $400,000 at that stage. So it was 1926, 1927. So Boyden Observatory was the first fully international observatory. It was run by the Boyden Observatory Council that consists obviously of prominent scientists or astronomers from the various observatories that obviously put telescopes up at the Boyden Observatory. So the first director was Dr. Robert Lindsay. But the Boyden Council was the model upon which the ESO, the European Southern Observatory Council, is based. So Boyden was the first fully international observatory run by a council. So this council was obviously joined by the University of the Free State. It was Prof. Flippy Groenewoud was the first University of the Free State representative of the Boyden Council, and he joined, or you can actually say the University of the Free State joined in 1965. Well, as a result of various reasons, financial and also political, many of the international scientists or universities dropped out from the collaboration, and in 1976, the Boyden Observatory was presented to the University of the Free State as a gift, and the first director was Professor Alan Jarrett. Famous astronomers that visited the Boyden Observatory was obviously Robert Lindsay, who was the director. He was also the director of the Armagh Observatory in Northern Ireland. Then also Jan Oort. He was the father of the Oort cloud, and that is the cloud that surrounds the solar system, and that is obviously the cloud that hosts all the comets that are obviously from time to time entering the solar system. And probably the most famous of all is Georges Lemaitre. He was a Belgian, he was a priest and also a mathematician. And he also was the first who showed that the universe actually started out from a explosion as a primeval atom, so that the whole universe was basically contained in a small space, and as a result of an explosion, it started out as a Big Bang. So he was essentially the father of Big Bang cosmology. And he also was one of the very prominent scientists who visited the Boyden Observatory. So this photo was taken in front of the main building, the entrance of the main building at the Boyden Observatory. I can just say some of the earliest achievements. The Harvard woman scientist who used Boyden data was Henrietta Leavitt, who discovered the period luminosity law, who unlocked the whole universe in terms of the distance scale. Annie Jump Cannon developed the first serious system for cataloging stars, and she worked through a whole, you cannot imagine the amount of stars that she studied using Boyden data, more than 350,000 stars that she cataloged. It is just absolutely mind-boggling. Williamina Fleming developed a common designation of stars. Cecilia Payne-Kapuskin proved that stars consisted of hydrogen and helium, and she actually started modern stellar astrophysics. The first photographic atlas was produced basically of the whole sky in 1903. So one of these telescopes was used in 1888 to take the first picture of Mars. That was at Arequipa in Peru. And then obviously took a total of about 200,000 photographic plates, which were all digitized and used daily by astronomers all over the world, and many more. So I think I don't need to convince you anymore that the Boyden Observatory, which was obviously part of the Harvard College Observatory, first in Arequipa and later at Bloemfontein, was very instrumental in opening up the southern sky for us. Well, I've mentioned that Boyden was transferred to the University of the Free State in the mid-1970s. Not much was done at the observatory. The observatory was basically taken care of by individuals, they call themselves the Friends of Boyden. They are just amateur astronomers. And in the mid-1990s, there was an opportunity to upgrade the Boyden 1.5 meter telescope and to integrate it in a global network, looking for lensing, gravitational lensing anomalies, which could be used to search for planets around distant stars, far away from the solar system, mostly towards the center of the Milky Way galaxy. So how does that work? If a telescope here on Earth look at a very distant star, and if there's a foreground star that has a planet that orbits that foreground star, and if that star with its planet move through the line of sight, in other words, between the telescope and the distant background source, the background star, then that planet could obviously, its gravitational potential could provide an additional increase in the intensity profile. And obviously that sharp blip that you see there is the result of the microlensing event where the planet obviously provides a disturbance, and obviously its gravitational field is focusing more of the light of the background source towards the observer, and this is how you would detect the planet around the foreground star. So one could use this technique to look for planets around stars that are not associated with the local part of the Milky Way galaxy. So we got a grant from overseas universities and also the NRF to refurbish the 1.5 meter telescope to allow it to participate in this international venture. When the cargo arrived at the Boyden Observatory and they hoist the cargo, which is the telescope control system, which costed at that stage about 500,000 rand. I was petrified, and this was just me standing there praying that this thing is not going to collapse, that this chains would hold, that the crate is not going to break up under the strain, and that we could get this cargo safely into the telescope dome. So this allowed us to start to participate in this international collaboration. So there were quite a number of telescopes that were integrated in this network, because if you identify the gravitational microlens event, you want to monitor this event to see how the light of the background star, how that light flux increases, how that background star brightens, and obviously you need uninterrupted coverage to see the microlens event of the planet, that sharp spike that I mentioned earlier, that sharp spike. So you obviously need to observe this continuously in order to obviously identify that sharp spike which is produced by the planet's gravitational field. And that is obviously you need telescopes that could be positioned right across the globe. And this is now in the Southern Hemisphere. The Boyden Observatory, Perth, and also Canopus telescope, and which is in, I think that was in, is it Tasmania or New Zealand? I'm not sure. Tasmania, I think. And the other one is the southern the telescopes, the Danish telescope in La Silla in South America. One of our key discoveries was this 5.5 Earth mass planet that is orbiting a star very close to the galactic center. So we could identify the mass of the planet around the stars, 5.5 Earth masses. The orbital period would be around 11 hours. The surface temperature of this planet would typically be of the order of minus 200 degrees Celsius. And it's a rocky planet with an icy surface. It's not a gas planet. So this was one of our big discoveries, and I think that was also published in the prestigious journal Nature. So this is the research telescopes today, the Boyden Observatory. So this is how the observatory looks like today. Here you can see a number of telescopes. I'm going to look at a few important ones. So this is our workhorse for research, the Boyden 1.5 meter telescope. So I can just say it, but I don't have to mention it to you. The size of a telescope is determined by either its lens, if it's a refractor, or the diameter of its mirror, if it's a reflector telescope. So this telescope has a mirror diameter of 1.5 meters. So this is why it's called the Boyden 1.5 meter telescope. So this is a photo of the 1.5 meter telescope inside the dome. And this is also the telescope that we are currently upgrading for remote operations. So this is just a slide showing our technicians working on the mirror shutters. So what we are aiming to do is what one of my PhD students is doing currently. In our astrophysics laboratory, in the physics building, we have introduced a number of computers that could be connected via the internet over a distance of 700 or so kilometers to the telescopes at Sutherland, especially these two telescopes, the SAO 1 meter telescope as well as the SAO 1.9 meter telescope. So by VPN into their system, we can actually operate these telescopes from within the physics building at the University of the Free State. So here I can just show you. So what Helene is doing with her research. So because of the cameras that are being installed inside the dome, she can actually see everything on her consoles, on her computer inside the physics building. She can see when the dome opens up. And she can obviously monitor the position of the telescope. She can see where the telescope is pointing into the sky and that the dome is open. And then obviously she can see that the telescope is now, when she typed in the coordinates of the star that she wants to observe, she can see that the telescope is actually moving. So there you can see the telescope is moving slowly to a position that she obviously feeds in via computer. And this is how we also want to control the telescope, the Boyden 1.5 meter telescope, so that you don't have to send observers and students to the telescope at night. And the telescope can be obviously controlled from within the physics building. So that is what we are busy with at the moment with the Boyden 1.5 meter telescope. Then there's another fully robotic telescope that is operated by the University College of Dublin. It is called the Watcher telescope, and the Watcher telescope obviously look for afterglows of gamma ray burst explosions in the sky. This is just a nighttime picture of the Watcher telescope showing the star trails and the South Celestial Pole. So Watcher obviously is linked to a network that study cosmic gamma ray burst afterglows. So if a gamma ray or an X-ray satellite detect a gamma ray burst event, they send out the coordinates to ground-based observatories, and obviously and also the Watcher telescope at Boyden is one of those telescopes. And then the Watcher telescope can find the afterglow very quickly, and over a period of time can obviously measure the decay of this afterglow. And by doing so, one can also identify the host galaxy where this gamma ray burst event occurred. So this is just the decay afterglow times the sort of light curve of one of the gamma ray bursts, 083319b. And this gamma ray burst was 1 billion times more luminous than ordinary supernovae, and the most distant object that we have ever detected at a look-back time of 6 billion years. And the total explosion energy that was released was about 2 times 10 to the 47 joule, or 2 times 10 to the 40 ergs. And obviously by studying this event, one could determine the Z, the redshift value, the cosmic redshift value, which was equal to 1. And that corresponds to obviously a look-back time of 6.5 billion years. Then there's another telescope, a robotic telescope that have been introduced to the Boyden Observatory in the last year, 2 or 3. That is the BOETUS 6 station that is located at Boyden. So BOETUS stands for Burst Observer and Optical Transient Exploring System. So this is a global network of robotic astronomical observatories, and there are 7 sites all around the globe. So here are just a couple of images of the BOETUS telescope. It is a very, very powerful telescope. Its mirror diameter is 60 centimeters. And it is equipped with a very, very sensitive CCD camera, obviously to detect very fine sources. And I can just tell you that the slew time, if you locate a source in the sky, then this telescope can obviously slew to that position in about 1 or 2 seconds. Even if the angle that it has to cover is close to 90 degrees, let's say 70 or 80 degrees, it can be on the position of that star within 2 or 3 seconds, which is absolutely mind-boggling. It's a very sophisticated telescope, and obviously I myself, with my graduate students, also have access to this telescope. It's part of the MOU between us and the network, the international network that put up that telescope. So this light curves that you see there is from one of my MSc students, Largashu Mini, who studied highly magnetic white dwarfs that acts as pulsars that produce very regular pulsed emission. So that what you see there is pulsed emission from an isolated white dwarf that rotates very rapidly and produce beams of emission like an ordinary pulsar. This was obviously observed with the BOETUS 6 station at Boyden. And then one of my current MSc students, we are studying sources, we call it dwarf novae. It is basically a cataclysmic variable. I will say more about that a little bit later, which produce outbursts from time to time. And during these outbursts, we think that there may also be events of particle acceleration and radio emission that could be detected by a very sensitive radio telescope like the Meerkat radio telescope. So this is what I'm doing with one of my other students, Keith McPherson, where we are obviously looking at these dwarf novae sources to see if we can obviously identify events that could be detected by the Meerkat radio telescope. Then there are other telescopes, very smaller telescopes at Boyden, like Slingshot. Now, Slingshot is a telescope. It's operated by Slingshot Aerospace in the US, which studies the motion of satellites that orbit Earth to obviously see if there are orbits that are decaying or changing, which could be worrisome if obviously these satellites would entering the Earth's atmosphere and obviously burn out incompletely and obviously crash into one of the continents or one of the cities that could obviously cause havoc here locally. So this is obviously a very important project for us because of the monitoring of satellite orbits, but obviously also we charge them site fees and we earn some revenue to upkeep the site. Then we also have collaboration with observatory in the Czech Republic. in Brno, from the Masaryk University in Brno, which have obviously installed another remotely controllable telescope at the Boyden Observatory, and they all are also looking at binary stars. But we are not so part of that research, but we also obviously get some revenue from the research, from the hosting the telescope. So this is basically what the astrophysics research group look like at the moment. We have a couple of permanent staff members. Then we also have quite a number of master students that are busy with their master's research. We have a number of PhD students. I have a postdoc that work with me at the moment, Spencer Madzime. He finished his PhD with me last year. He graduated in April this year, and we are going to continue the work that he did for his PhD, because he basically discovered quite a number of very interesting potential gamma ray sources that we are obviously want to follow up. And this is our honors class of 2026. So we have a small honors group this year, but they are all three of them are very, very fine, very bright students. And then obviously one cannot do a world-class research if you don't have obviously other collaborators. So we have three very, very experienced and very able affiliated professors. Professor David Buckley from the SAO, he's an NRF B-rated scientist. Professor Phil Charles, he's currently back in the UK. He's also associated with the Southampton Physics Department and also the University of Oxford. He was a former director of the South African Astronomical Observatory and an NRF A-rated researcher, and also Professor Richard Gray from the Appalachian State University, which is a world expert in stellar spectroscopy, and he also developed and built a spectropolarimeter for our research at the Boyden Observatory. So the techniques that we are using for our research is obviously photometry, where we study the time variation of the brightness of astronomical sources. And this is very important. Obviously, sources can vary as a result of binary motion. You can have a star, two stars that orbit one another, and when one star moves in front of the other, the brightness can vary. Or the star can pulsate, and as a result of that pulsation and measuring the pulsation period like the Cepheid variables, we can determine the distances to these stars. And the type of sources that I'm interested in is obviously these dwarf novae sources, where you have a white dwarf that accretes material from an accretion disk. As a result of disk viscosity that can build up over time, the disk can brighten, increasing the viscosity and the temperature even more, and that will lead to a gigantic outburst. And in that outburst event, enormous amounts of material can move in radially inward to the compact object, where it can accrete and produce enormous amounts of radiation. And to do this, obviously, you need a very sensitive astronomical camera. We call it a CCD camera. This camera is now obviously in operation for close to 20 years, I would say 17 or so years, the Apogee camera. It is a very, very sensitive camera with a quantum efficiency of close to 90% or so. That quantum efficiency basically means how effective it is to convert the energy of a light photon to electrical pulse that can be measured. Then there's another technique, spectroscopy, where you break up the light into the various colors. and to measure the spectrum of a star. This is very, very important. And for this research, we obviously started the collaboration quite a number of years ago with the Appalachian State University, and more specifically with Professor Richard Gray, which has become a very close colleague and good friend of mine. Now, Professor Gray spent a period here at the Boyden Observatory on a Fulbright scholarship. He's also the author, or one of the authors, of one of the very prominent textbooks of stellar spectroscopy. Here you can read for yourself the reviews that he received. And Professor Gray is a world authority in stellar spectroscopy, but not just stellar spectroscopy, also the building of spectrographs. He designed and built a spectrograph in collaboration with the University of the Free State Instrumentation Division. Here you can see a photo of that spectrograph, which has been installed at the Boyden Observatory on a 1.5 meter telescope. So why is spectroscopy so handy? Obviously by observing different stars and measuring their spectra, you can obviously classify the stars. That is what Annie Jump Cannon did. You can also get an idea by using the Doppler shift. If you look at the source, and if that source is moving away from you, the spectral lines will mostly be shifted towards the red end of the spectrum. And if the source is moving towards you to the blue end of the spectrum, this is called the Doppler shift. And by obviously measuring that Doppler shift and measuring the wavelength of the wavelength shift, then obviously you can measure the velocity with which the source is either moving towards you or away from you. So you can obviously also get a good idea of the kinematics of your astronomical source that you are studying. In my own line of research, we use spectroscopy to look at the spectral lines of accretion disks around creating white dwarfs in cataclysmic variables. You can see if you get a spectrum of such an accretion disk, the spectral line is shifted in two parts. You have two peaks there. That is just because of one part of the disk is moving towards you, one part is moving away from you. So you can get a blue shifted and also a red shifted spectral line. In order to get this double peak, obviously the orbital inclination should be quite high. In other words, the inclination angle is the angle between the normal to the accretion disk and obviously the line of sight towards the observer. So high inclination means that you are actually looking at the source basically at an angle close to the orbital plane of the system itself. Then obviously you see a very prominent double-peaked emission line. But if you look at the position of the minimum, if the spectral line, you can see there's a wiggle. So this double peak obviously is superimposed on the orbital period as well. So you can obviously measure the orbital period by just looking at this wiggle of the spectral line, and you can see it also on this left-hand side. So what do we study? My specific research focuses on the cataclysmic variables. I'm very interested in these systems. They are very compact binaries consisting of a small red dwarf star that overflows its Roche lobe and transfers material to this compact white dwarf, which can accrete the material via an accretion disk. And like I've mentioned earlier, material can accumulate in this accretion disk until the disk becomes so unstable as a result of the viscosity, and it feeds an enormous material radially into the system towards the compact white dwarf, where that material is released or the gravitational potential energy of that material is released in radiation. So I can just say these cataclysmic variables, I've mentioned, they are very compact binaries. The whole system can fit in comfortably into the sun. So the orbital diameter is smaller than the diameter of the sun. So they are extremely compact systems. So I can just mention the results of one of my PhD students. You would remember the face also. She's also a lecturer, but doing her PhD part-time. This was some of the results that she presented in 2024 at the COSPAR conference in South Korea, where we looked at one of these stars. You can see the highly variable emission as a result of the orbital motion, which could determine the orbital period of the system, which is about 2.3 days. And she did this by using the 1 meter telescope at Sutherland in remote operations mode. In other words, from in the physics department at the University of the Free State, and also using data of the SALT telescope. She could use that SALT spectra to determine the orbital period, the radial velocity profile of certain spectral lines. This is the spectral line of doubly ionized helium, which is obviously produced close to the compact object as a result of the enormous radiation pressure. There's a very strong wind of ionized material that flow away from the compact object. And that is that is why you don't see a double-peaked line of helium. You do see, though, from unionized helium, because we think that this emission line, which is double-peaked, originates close to the star that is feeding the material in, or the outer part of the accretion disk, which is much cooler. The inner part of the disk where the helium is ionized is very hot, and it produces obviously a wind of charged particles that are blown away from the white dwarf. And that is why you see a very broad emission line of ionized helium, but you don't see the double peak. In other words, you don't see the signature of the accretion disk itself. And by studying this particular source, we could see that this particular system is a very interesting candidate for supernova 1A source. Then we are also studying pulsed emission from compact objects like neutron stars and white dwarfs. You will remember, I think a year or 2 or 3 ago, I presented the talk at your club where I looked at these 2 sources, AR Scorpii and AE Quaerae. We also presented these results at a very prestigious conference on general relativity, the Marcel Grossman meeting on general relativity. By using the telescopes at Boyden, we could obviously, by doing photometric measurements, we could measure the pulse period of this fast rotating white dwarf. You can see the period is about 1.97 minutes. So this orbital motion profile that you see there, the green and red curve is just standard background stars that we observe. So this sinusoidal light curve that you see there is just the orbital motion, and this big scatter is nothing else than the pulse period that you can see there. The amplitude variation is close to 1 magnitude. That is absolutely amazing. So this was measured using astronomical photometry with the 1.5 meter telescope at Boyden. But by using telescopes at Sutherland also, Helen could obviously study the spectral lines, especially the H-beta spectral line, and you could see clearly this sinusoidal variation in the H-beta spectral line, which is nothing else then the white dwarf that is illuminating, it is spraying the surface that is facing the white dwarf with a beam of high energy particles and photons, heating it up, producing that H-beta emission line. And since the whole system is orbiting the common center of mass, you could obviously get this radial velocity profile, and from that obviously determine also the orbital period and constrain also the mass of both the secondary star that is orbiting around the white dwarf as well as the white dwarf itself. So this is just how you can use either photometry as well as spectroscopy to determine the parameters of the source that you are studying. Then we are also looking at gamma ray binaries. So that is when you have a very massive star with a big disk. We call it an excretion disk around the star. It is typically an O or B type star that orbits very rapidly. And as a result of the centrifugal forces, material is leaving the equatorial region of the star, and obviously that is when you get such a disk of material around the star. And around the star, you have a pulsar or a black hole that orbits in a very eccentric orbit. And when this compact object moves through that gaseous disk, it produces a high energy radiation in terms of X-ray and gamma ray emission. But then we are also looking at the emission from active galactic nuclei, more specifically blazar sources. So our focus is to study these sources across the electromagnetic spectrum using, obviously, since we are looking at transient sources where enormous amounts of radiation is produced, the chances are good that we can get gamma ray emission that we can obviously study with the Fermi Gamma Ray Telescope, X-ray emission typically with the satellites like Chandra or the XMM Newton Telescope or SWIFT, and also optical telescopes positioned here on Earth, and also radio telescopes, typically the SKA or the Meerkat telescope that is currently constructed there at Carnarvon in the Northern Cape. Why are we studying these sources in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum? Because by just looking at this spiral galaxy, one can see that in different parts of the spectrum, you can see different features. So here in radio and infrared, you can see the spiral arms very clearly, and also these bright spots are just regions where new stars are being born continuously. And also here in the ultraviolet and the X-ray part of the spectrum, you see the central regions of the galaxy where the supermassive black hole resides very clearly. So in different parts of the spectrum, you see different features of the source, and that is why we are focusing on multi-wavelength astronomy. And that also allows us to use telescopes, obviously the different telescopes in different wavelength regimes, like the telescopes at Sutherland, the SALT telescope, the 1.9 meter telescope, the Meerkat radio telescope, the HESS and CTH Renkov telescopes in Namibia and La Palma, respectively. We are part of those international collaborations, and also the Fermi telescope that I've mentioned earlier. You would remember I started this talk when I showed the very prominent researchers, astronomers, that visited the Boyden Observatory in the past. Well, there was one other very prominent scientist, Kip Thorne, that visited us in 2010. He visited the physics department at the University of the Free State and also the Boyden Observatory, where they discussed the signatures of gravitational sources that are spiraling in, like for example, binary black holes that spiral in as a result of the the emission of gravitational waves where the whole binary black hole loses orbital angular momentum, and as a result of that, they will spiral in and produce, obviously, a gravitational signature. This was in 2010. This was before the first gravitational wave signatures were detected. The first one was discovered on the 11th of February, or reported actually on the 11th of February 2016, when the first gravitational event was discovered from a binary black hole merger. And this was absolutely a seminal discovery, because this was the first direct discovery of gravitational waves that were obviously predicted by Einstein's theory of general relativity about a century earlier. Exactly a century earlier. Amazing. So since then, a few more of these gravitational waves sort of events were discovered, where binary black holes, as a result of gravitational waves, spiral in and collide. But these events doesn't produce any electromagnetic signature, because black holes don't produce electromagnetic waves. But as a result of this discovery, three of these people that were obviously involved in these gravitational wave detectors, the interferometers, like Rainer Weiss, Barry Barish, and Kip Thorne, received the Nobel Prize in 2017. But that all changed on the 17th of August 2017, when the gravitational wave event was discovered of two neutron stars, not black holes, but neutron stars that consist of baryonic matter, spiraled in and produced an enormous explosion that was detected by these gravitational wave detectors in Livingston and Hanford. Virgo didn't detect it, and as a result of that non-detection, obviously that helped us to constrain the position of where the gravitational event was produced. And as a result, and what I've said earlier, it was two neutron stars that spiraled in and produced this gigantic explosion. And we could detect, obviously, electromagnetic radiation in optical as well as in gamma rays, and also other electromagnetic wavelengths. These events are extremely important, because through these collisions, when two of these very compact stars, neutron stars, they have about the mass of the sun, but they have the size of a town like Hermanus, about 10 kilometers in diameter. When they crash into one another, it's an enormous explosion, producing jets of beamed radiation. But by studying the spectra, by studying this in optical through spectroscopy, and we could obviously determine the spectra that was produced by the elements that were created in these explosions. And this was particularly the spectra of this event in 2017 produced very, very broad emission lines of the so-called rare earth elements. And for a long time it was we wondered how these elements, these rare earths, are produced. And now we know, because these rare earth elements, the so-called lanthanides, are typically produced in these events where very compact stars like neutron stars, they orbit one another, they produce gravitational waves, and obviously this gravitational waves drain orbital angular momentum from the system up to a point where they crash into one another and obviously produce beams of radiation, but also these very, very rare elements. And now we know how these are produced, because we found from the spectral spectroscopy of these observations, we could obviously determine the spectra and determine obviously the elements that were producing the spectra. Obviously, when the event was identified, telescopes in the southern hemisphere, like the Hess telescope in Namibia, the Boyden telescope outside Bloemfontein, and also telescopes at Sutherland, obviously started to monitor the fading of this gamma ray burst event that was observed. So Boyden was with Sutherland quite instrumental in measuring out the whole light curve, the decay of this event. So Boyden results integrated with SALT and SAO results in 9 refereed papers, including Nature and Science. SALT spectra with the Boyden light curve obviously resulted in this multi-messenger paper, which had about 3,700 authors on. And the SALT-Boyden data also helped to build a model for this particular merger event. So this is the light curve, and like I've mentioned, the Boyden Observatory, the 1.5 meter telescope, played a crucial role also in determining or measuring out that light curve, and also helped to constrain several key parameters related to these kilonova events. Well, then we also have a very active public outreach program that is run by my colleague and friend, Professor Marty Hoffman. Most of you will probably know him. He's very prominent sort of communicator of science, very active on some of the local South African radio stations. And he's driving this public outreach and educational program at the Naval Hill Planetarium with one of my other colleagues, Mr. Davie van Jaarsveld. He's not an astronomer, but he's very interested in the history of astronomy, especially the history of the Boyden Observatory. And in the first part of this presentation, I made use of a lot of material that he made available for us. Obviously, we like it if school groups and the public visit our observatory so that we can share the observatory with them. And I want also to highlight a very, very important phrase that was obviously used quite often by Edward Pickering. He was the first director of the Harvard College Observatory, from which the Boyden Observatory obviously developed. He said that science is an ennobling pursuit only when it is unselfish. In other words, when you share it with the community. Because we have to remember as scientists, in a few years, I'm going to retire in a few years, and then I will not be available anymore. And some of my younger colleagues in a decade, 2 or 3, they will also not be present anymore. But obviously, then we still want a legacy, and the legacy will obviously the people with which we share the observatory and the facilities at Boyden. So that is also something very near and dear to us. Next year, it will be 100 years that the Boyden Observatory will be at the Boyden site outside Bloemfontein. So it dates back in 1889 when Harvard College Observatory established it in Peru, South America, to advance research under the clear Andean skies. Yet seeking even more optimal conditions, Boyden was relocated to Bloemfontein in 1927, where it has since become a cornerstone of international astrophysical research and a symbol of South African scientific excellence. So from the early beginnings, its legacy continues. So this is where I'm going to stop my presentation for this evening. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege for me to present this talk to you, and obviously to share some of the highlights of the Harvard College Observatory, out of which the Boyden Observatory developed, and to share it also with very interested audience there in the beautiful Western Cape. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that was really fascinating. Great insights
I can just mention the last slide I have here, 2 websites if you want to visit the Stars of Bloom. This is a website developed by my colleague Davie van Jaarsveld, which is basically the Friends of Boyden, which obviously shows the activities at the Boyden Observatory as well as the Naval Hill Planetarium. And this is also a document that Davie posted, the history of the Boyden Observatory, which you can also find at this website. If you are interested, I can obviously email these 2 websites to my colleague and friend there, Pieter Kotze, and he can share it with you if you cannot access it from this venue, from this presentation. But since you have recorded it, I think you will obviously be able to share this with the local community there in Hermanus.
Okay, that was excellent. Thanks very much. A lot of stuff I've never heard of before. The history, I didn't realize a lot of insights into the global sort of footprint of the Boyden Observatory and its history and so on. And you spoke of an enormous amount of very, very interesting science, very important science that has been done and so on. So, very, very fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Have we got time for a couple of quick questions from the audience? I'm going to ask the audience to ask me the questions, and I'm going to repeat them quickly to you, just so that the recording can pick them up.
Okay.
Have we got some questions from the audience?
May I ask a little?
They're all saying thank you for a very excellent presentation. I just want to check on the Zoom participants. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can unmute your mic and ask a question, or else type it in the chat. Chris Stewart has got his hand up. Chris, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. It brought back a lot of memories for me, and I'm really happy to see how vibrant and active the observatory is now. I was an instigator of a small team that borrowed the entire observatory in order to observe the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet crash. And at that time, the observatory was on the brink of being sold off as a sort of old boys club. But by virtue of the comet crash excitement, we provided high-resolution live images to the SABC. So everybody from here to Europe got to see images straight off the 60-inch. And it created so much interest that the Friends of Boyden were sort of established, and the observatory was saved. So I'm really happy to see how active it is now. And again, thanks for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else got a question or comment?
Okay, can I just ask a small question?
Go ahead, Peter.
Pete, yes, I would like to know, how do you distinguish between the signal of two neutron stars colliding and 2 black holes colliding? What is the distinguishing signature that you're looking at?
Yeah, for 2 black holes that collide, one must remember they are just 2 gravitational disturbances and orbiting one another. They produce gravitational waves, and when they actually collide, there's no electromagnetic signature. So it's just basically a signature in gravitational waves. So there's no electromagnetic signature. So in other words, and also no particles. For example, when two neutron stars collide, like this event that we detected in 2017, there were signatures in gamma rays, gamma ray emission that was detected by the Fermi gamma ray telescope. You can see that burst of emission there. It was detected by the Fermi gamma ray telescope in energies of about, let's say, 10 giga electron volt and higher. But the X-ray telescope, the integral X-ray telescope, also detected a very sharp pulse of emission. So this is how you would distinguish between, you can say, a sterile black hole merger, which just basically produces an enormous amount of gravitational waves, and two neutron stars that collide with one another that produce also electromagnetic radiation through gamma rays, but not just gamma rays, also neutrinos, neutrino particles that could be detected in these events. So one can say that the production of radiation, especially gamma ray radiation, is one of the signatures that this is not a black hole merger, but a merger of two neutron stars, for example. And obviously, if you point your optical telescopes like SALT with a powerful spectrograph to this event, to this afterglow, and you see obviously these enormous broad emission lines, then obviously one can, let me see where it is, yeah, these broad emission lines, then obviously one know that you deal here with the merger of two objects containing baryonic matter like neutron stars that could produce these rare earth metals. And obviously the width of the spectral lines tells you the enormous temperature of this explosion that was released in this explosion, and that was also why the spectral lines are so broad. The broadness of the spectral lines is an indicator of the velocity of the material that is released in these explosions.
Thanks, Pete. That explains everything. Many thanks.
I presume you can also get an idea of the mass of the objects which collided from all the observations, which would tell you they were probably too small to have been a black hole or not.
Yes, yeah. So obviously, by doing careful observations, one can obviously determine the mass of these black holes. So obviously, through modeling also the merging neutron stars, they found a total mass of 2.8 solar masses. So the one of the objects had a mass of between 1.4 and 2.3 solar masses. The other one slightly lighter, 0.9 to 1.4 solar mass.
Great. Go ahead, Nick.
By the poles tend to attract or certainly attract the deposits.
Okay, there's sort of a geography question here. Why do they find rare earth deposits in Greenland, Nick? Yeah, Mr. Trump's interest. I don't know. Why do we find them in certain places on Earth? I don't know if that's an astronomy answer to it.
Yes, I cannot think at this moment. I will think a little bit about this. If I can find the answer, I'm more than happy to share it via the email or so. But obviously, it depends on how where you mine for them. I mean, and obviously, it's not to say that it's only located at specific locations like Greenland, for example. We have to remember that the solar system was also produced. The sun was produced from an explosion of very massive stars, and it could have also been a kilonova explosion, which obviously resulted in these elements, these rare earths, to be part of the elements that were released by that massive explosion that formed the sun. eventually 5 billion years ago. So it's not impossible that these elements obviously would also be found on Earth, given how the solar system formed from the explosion of a massive star, or even maybe produced by such a kilonova event more than 5 billion years ago.
By the way, there is a rare earth mine in the Western Cape, along the west coast somewhere, which is owned by Anglo American, which was
Yes,
designated as non-viable or not. And I think there's the recent demand, I think there's new interest in trying to get it back. I think we've got a couple of geologists here who might be engineers that could tell us about it.
yes, I would like to
Okay,
hear
go ahead,
that.
Elaine. You got a question?
Who's that? Is that me?
Wait, just a second. David, just hold on. Go ahead, Elaine.
So that you to cover almost the entire range of the electromagnetic spectrum. Or there's some outstanding bits.
Okay, so Elaine was just asking the question, with a huge variety of telescopes and so on that you work with, is the objective to cover a huge range of frequencies, or do you focus on something more specific, or do you just cover everything?
Yeah, so I want to return to this slide that I showed earlier. If you study sources in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, you can see different parts of the source. For example, this Whirlpool galaxy, which is just a normal spiral galaxy, you can see if you look at this galaxy in radio wavelengths and infrared and optical, you see the spiral arms. But the moment that you go to higher energies like X-ray, for example, there obviously you are studying the inner parts of the galaxy, there where the supermassive black hole resides. So in other words, in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, you see different aspects of the source that you are studying. So that is why we want to put together information from different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum so that we can actually study the source holistically. In other words, to get a full picture of the source that we are investigating.
Okay, thanks. Then David Clark Brown, you had a question. You just got to unmute your mic again. David, can you hear me?
There you go.
There we go.
Yes, no, thank you. It's been an incredibly amazing lecture. Thank you. I was wondering, it's taking a photograph of our galaxy. It's like taking a camera and putting it in one of your toes and photographing the whole body. I was wondering, how do we know it's a disc or spiral shape? And then the second comment was, I thought rare earth minerals were spread all around. It's just that they're very diluted or very sparse. But you seem to say that rare earths are in certain areas. But that's just a comment. But I was wondering, how do we know the shape of our own galaxy from one of the outer arms? And you give such a nice spiral photograph of from billions of years away. Yeah. How do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, David. Let's wait for the answer.
That's a good question. Let me just see. I don't think I have a figure here. Let me just see, scroll right back to the beginning. Let me see. If you look up at the night sky, let me just see there. I think maybe I have there right at the beginning. Uh,
Got a lot of slides.
yes, yeah. So if you look at this, sorry, I don't have maybe I should have thought of it, but this is obviously an image of the southern sky, and there you can see basically the Milky Way. These dark patches that you can see are just basically molecular cloud complexes that obviously where new stars are being born. So you're looking at this picture of the Milky Way galaxy, and it only really makes sense if you are basically uh, inside a disk of a galaxy and looking outward, and then obviously all the stars are located more or less in a band across the sky. But yeah, so that is basically one answer that I can give of the shape of the Milky Way galaxy being a spiral galaxy. But I think a better answer would be to look at the entire sky in gamma ray wavelengths. If you look at the entire sky in gamma ray wavelengths, in other words, if you take a galactic, you take all the gamma ray emissions that you can see from all the directions, then you can see that all the emission basically is located in a plane. That is basically the Milky Way galaxy. Now you may ask, but how come is the Milky Way galaxy such a strong source of gamma ray radiation? Well, it isn't. But the Milky Way galaxy with the spiral arms containing cold molecular gas acts as a target for high energy particles and gamma rays that are produced in the external galaxies, in active galactic nuclei and blazars, which have an isotropic distribution on cosmologically. And since the Milky Way galaxy acts as a target, then obviously it produces a glow in gamma ray emission, and that is confined to a plane. And that tells us that obviously the Milky Way galaxy must be a normal spiral galaxy, because it shines so bright in gamma rays, not because it produces gamma rays, but being sort of sprayed by high energy particles and gamma rays from the quasars and blazars on cosmological scales that have an isotropic distribution, and that produce a nice flat distribution of gamma ray emission in the plane of the Milky Way galaxy.
And then also, with the measurement of the distances to stars, doesn't it also give you a relative, almost sort of a 3D visualization of the layout of the Milky Way galaxy?
Yes, this was already done about 100 years ago by astronomers like Harlow Shapley, which basically used data also from the Harvard College Observatory to construct a model of the Milky Way galaxy. And he found that the best model for the Milky Way galaxy is a disk. So that obviously combined with later data and obviously knowledge that came later, that the Milky Way is just a normal spiral galaxy, much like the Andromeda galaxy.
This image you've got up there of the Milky Way with its comet in there and the LMC, Large Magellanic and Small Magellanic Cloud in it, would make a very nice poster, I must say.
Yes, it does. It does.
If you don't mind, another slightly related question is how does a meteor or a shooting star, how does it leave a tail if there's no friction to rub off the outer layer of the asteroid, that we can see it?
You mean the comets, for these comets?
Yeah.
Okay, that is a very nice, that's an interesting question. Obviously, these comets are just icy bodies, very porous, icy bodies that obviously enter the solar system from the Kuiper Belt or the Oort Cloud. And as they obviously get closer to the sun, they are illuminated by sunlight. And obviously that is the sunlight, the radiation pressure from the sun actually boils off this material from the surfaces. And then obviously as this object heats up as a result of moving through the radiation field of the sun, it heats up internally. And since it's porous, it produces a lot of steam, where obviously an outgassing occurs, where the material obviously is boiled off from within and also from the surface of the object.
The real length
Thanks
of
very much.
the real length of that
Yeah,
compound
thank-
is enormous. Thanks, David. All right.
And thanks so much for being able to put it so simply. It's been wonderful. Thanks very much. Yeah. Thanks again.
All right, if there are no more questions for the moment, I'd like to wrap it up. Thanks very much to all the online people for their attendance as well. And this has all been recorded and it will be put up on YouTube, where you can just either search for it on my channel under Hermanus Astronomy, or we can send the links out as well. Okay, thanks very much. Excellent talk.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And thank you again for the invitation. It's much appreciated.
And of course, I'll send you the link to the recording. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
You too.
bye.
Bye.